Welcome to Flipping the Table. In this episode, Michael has a conversation with Craig McNamara, founder of Sierra Orchard, a regenerative walnut farm in Northern California. They talk about Craig's new book, Because Our Fathers Lied, that reveals the healing power that can result from cultivating a healthy relationship to the land and its soil. Enjoy the show.
I love reading history and biographies, which are simply personal histories always deeply linked to the context in which the described life was lived. Today, I have what for me is a special, actually thrilling conversation. It is with Craig McNamara. He is an organic walnut farmer in the outskirts of Winters, California. Winters is a small farming community not far from the UC Davis campus where Craig received his degree in plant and soil science. He is also the only son of Robert S McNamara, U.S. Secretary of Defense under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. Secretary McNamara is considered the primary architect of the Vietnam War, arguably the most painful period in the United States in the last half of the 20th century. It was a war that I watched on television as a kid, a war in which my neighbor Raymond Johnson was killed. Before joining the Kennedy administration, Robert McNamara had been president of the Ford Motor Company. After leaving the Johnson administration, he served as president of the World Bank. He was an historically giant man with an amazing level of achievements and infamy in the eyes of millions around the world. As his son, Craig was born to grapple with his father's legacy, and grapple he has. In his new memoir entitled Because Our Fathers Lied, Craig honestly and empathically describes his journey from a dyslexic prep school kid in relationship to the most powerful families in the nation, to angry anti-war activist at Stanford, to a refugee in Latin America, and home again as a committed agriculturalist who has created a 450-acre regenerative farm. His journey has been a classic hero's journey, not as dramatic as that of Odysseus or Luke Skywalker, but as full of near mythological characters, magical experiences, and trials of the body, mind, and heart. His story is reminiscent of the one portrayed in the film Forrest Gump, who seemed to participate in the major events and was related to the major figures of his time. The book is full of stories about describing moments with two presidents, his relationships with John and Jackie Kennedy, how he was part of the anti-war movement in the U.S. and the socialist Allende movement in Chile, how he met and conversed with Fidel Castro and Daniel Ellsberg about his father. Craig's life has been a journey of healing that allowed him to emerge from his father's shadow to become his own leader of a very different type. Craig is guided by a passion for justice, by his heart, and a vision of a healthy and peaceful world. He has created a beautiful farm that has played a significant role in his recovery from the wound resulting from his father's silence and role in our nation's history. Today, we'll talk about how he came back to his homeland to build that farm, meant to heal the human relationship to the earth, and eventually with the people of Vietnam. It is a moving story about the complex challenge of loving a powerful and baffling father. It is a story that gives me hope because it reflects how humans from one generation to the next can and do learn from the harms created by the divides of privilege and power. I hope you will enjoy my conversation with Craig McNamara. Welcome, Craig. It's so great to have this conversation with you because whether kayaking on Poudre Creek or sitting in your beautiful yard or memory-filled office where we are now, the subject of your father has often been a topic in our time together over the years. And yet, it took this book to reveal to me the full extent of your amazing journey. So why don't you describe what we're looking at as we look out the windows here? Where are we?
Well, welcome, Michael. It truly is wonderful to have you here at Sierra Orchards. We're in Solano County. Our watershed, as you mentioned, is the Puta Creek, which is named after the Putatoy Native Americans, the First Nation peoples who farmed here for millennia. So welcome. We're looking out at our walnut orchard, organic walnut orchard. You're seeing the black walnut roots and the English walnuts. And you asked me how the crop was. And you'll have to come back and see. October is the month when we shake the trees and sweep up the nuts and begin the process. So I hope it's a good harvest, and maybe in this journey of our conversation, we'll wrap around to farming and to climate change.
We will. And look at, I can see the walnuts out there, and there are on the tree just to my left, straight out, there are at least 5 or 6 on that one branch, maybe more, maybe 10.
Michael, are you also seeing the quail?
I see tons of quail, yeah.
And we've got great blue herons.
Saw the herons, I saw some hawks.
Well, the herons...
Turkeys?
The herons come and land in the field and hunt like cats for gophers, so we really appreciate
Love them. Yeah, so it's a beautiful day, and we're going to have an incredible conversation because of your incredible book. So I want to start with a very simple question. Why did you write this book now? Was it purely a result of inner timing, or did the wider political and social context in which we live, which is pretty remarkable right now, have a role in your decision to put it all on paper and make it visible to the world?
Well, thank you for launching that question. I would say immediately it wasn't because of where our world is today. It was much more because now I'm 72 years old. I was born on April 18th of 1950, and I realized that my entire adult life had been lived in one way or another through the lens of the Vietnam War, and consequently, because Robert S McNamara, my father, is thought of as the architect of the war, the book was really about my relationship to my father, my relationship to Vietnam, and the decisions that I have made in reflection of both of those relationships. And I had an amazing opportunity that Julie, my wife, and I participated in something called the Stanford Distinguished Careers Institute, and that was in 2018. That gave us a year of studying at Stanford. And we began in January of 2018, and I took a creative writing class that eventually turned into the beginning of my memoir. So that year gave me the time and space, both physically and emotionally and mentally, to begin this journey. And I want to just say, it was a private journey. You're a very, very dear friend of mine, and you expressed to me that you learned something new.
Many things new.
While reading this memoir. Well, my wife did too. She knew the details of my life and our lives together, but I don't think she knew some of the emotional unpacking. Mm-hmm. And the honest truth is, I didn't either. So the 4 years that it took me from beginning to publication was an amazing deep dive of kind of unpeeling my own onion and finding out really who I am.
Well, it's a remarkable journey. It's, as I said in the introduction, it's a hero's journey. I mean, it truly is. I mean, you read Joseph Campbell or Robert Bly or Michael Meade, and you understand that mythological journey which you took. And so I want people to understand what you were born into. And I know at the end of the book, a remarkable story that I'd never heard before. One of the things that blew me away is about the evening you had at the White House. Would you set the context for what you were born into and how that shaped the journey from that moment? Because you were in the presence of the king.
Well, I think you're referring to President Kennedy. And as I mentioned, I was born in 1950. So when my father was brought into President Kennedy's cabinet, he was sworn in January of 1961. I was 10 and a half years old when we moved to Washington, D.C., a brand new world, having grown up on a beautiful property with tree forts and gardens in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And my mom, of course, had found a home for us to rent. And the memory that you're referring to was the release of the movie PT-109. and many of our listeners may not remember. But
I saw it many times as a kid.
You did, okay. So President Kennedy served on the destroyer PT-109, and it was a story and a national movie about that. And I'm guessing that it was probably 1962. Do you remember?
I didn't see it till the mid '60s because I was quite young, but yeah.
Okay, so let's just say it's the summer of 1962, and President and Mrs. Kennedy have invited their family, friends, cabinet members, and children to the White House for the first showing of PT-109. And here we are in this amazing room of the White House. On the floor, kids are everywhere. The president was in his rocking chair, and the distance between us was a matter of feet. And watching the movie unfold, I can only imagine what it must have been like for the president to see himself portrayed on screen, in a combat situation, and kind of the glory of that environment. Well, I felt the glory of just being in the presence of a remarkable man. And throughout my life, I realized how singular that moment and several other moments that I shared in my early teens at the White House. And I kind of packed those away because I realized now that they would never happen again. Obviously, that president was assassinated, but I've only returned to the White House once or twice since that time. So those are amazing memories that began a life of politics for my family. It began a journey for my father that would lead him into literally the jungles of Vietnam and into an unwinnable war. And therefore, that kind of begins your and my conversation about this memoir, which really focuses on my life with my father in the context of what I'll call the American War.
Yeah, and I see it as a story of love. I see it as a story of the complexity of love, how to love, and the need for honesty in love, or the value of honesty and love, and also about healing. The North Star for this talk is where we're going to get to in the end about the farm and the role of agriculture in your life. But I want to actually jump from the White House, that period when you were 10 and a half, to your experience at Stanford in the 1960s. It seems to me this is where you'd been with all these mythological characters who were the most powerful people in the world, propagating a war that was unwinnable and was dividing the nation. And you were at Stanford at that time, and you became part of something very big that was in opposition to your father. So this is where the journey, the hero's journey, becomes very interesting, because you have to break away. So tell us about what that was like, Stanford, and why it led you to Latin America.
Well, first of all, the choice of going west. For me, it was not even a choice. Having been in Washington, D.C. for 19 years, or in that vicinity, the East Coast, and in the politic of the nation's capital and the global spotlight on capital and my father, I needed to head to a different part of the country to, in essence, leave that part of me, leave that part of my family. And so that was what prompted me to go west in 1969. So I was 19 years old, starting out as a freshman. And a thought that comes to me right now, Michael, that I do touch upon briefly in the book is, here I am, a freshman in a dorm, a new dorm roommate. Donner Hall was the name of our dorm. And in my mailbox that fall arrives a letter from the Department of Defense, and it is my induction. It is letting me know that I've been called to go to an induction center in Oakland to take to a draft board to take my physical to prepare me for service in the military. That in itself was an incredibly resounding and traumatic experience. Men across the nation, just like me, were being called up into the draft.
And killed in Vietnam.
Very much so. And many of those men didn't have the opportunities that I had to go to college. Many of them did. Those that did had the opportunity to take a deferment, a college deferment. It did not seem correct to me that men who were not in college, many of whom were black and brown, were serving in Vietnam and dying at a rate much higher than those of my white background. So I went around the Bay in a bus to the Oakland Draft Board, and like thousands of men, stripped naked, went through the humiliation of being drafted and touched and poked and peed and pooped, came to the end of the medical, and there was a man who looked very much like myself, long hair, bearded, glasses, and he was the shrink. And I figured that he probably would understand the fact that I have had ulcers. I'd had ulcers for years at that time, as my mother did, and that would probably eliminate me from the draft. It did not. I came out with a 1A. So that is a story unto itself. But I think your question is, what was happening inside of my mind? I remember standing at the San Francisco airport protesting the war and reading the list one by one of the men, and this was 1969, the fall, who had been killed in combat in Vietnam. And it was a lengthy, lengthy list. I remember the passengers coming off of planes or getting onto planes at that time who would pass by in the lobby of the airport and scowl at me, curse at me, spit at me for protesting the war. So this was an amazing induction, amazing introduction to the war for me. Classes at the time at Stanford were being disruptive, and I was part of a guerrilla theater troupe, and we would materialize, we would have theater prepared that we would go into lecture halls and disrupt classes. It was my first introduction to civil disobedience, and something that I believed in then, and to this day I do believe in civil disobedience. So those are some of my early memories, Michael, of what it was like to be a freshman in 1969 at an incredibly tragic crossroads in America's involvement in the Vietnam War.
Mm-hmm. And that led you to make a decision to leave, right? I mean, you it got so violent and there were so many things happening. You took off, right? And you went with some buddies, you got on motorcycles and you headed south.
What I realized was that I was falling out of love with my country, a country that I was born into. I will say here, born into white privilege, but it was a country that was wrong. It was a country that had made decisions to invade another country, that was witnessing a lengthy civil war. It was absolutely wrong.
And actually, it's not just the country, it was your father and the presidents making decisions.
Yes, and Michael, this may be a moment in our conversation for me to say several things about my ability and inability to converse with my father about Vietnam. I tried many times, and my father had an impermeable shield. A wall that was just, I could not go through it. I could not go around it. On one occasion, long after his service as Secretary of Defense, I asked him why he could not address the inability that he had to acknowledge that the war was not winnable. Why did it take him so long to apologize in 1995 in his memoir, in retrospect? And the only thing I remember from that conversation is his saying loyalty to the presidents that he served. And what I want to quote you here is an interview that I found in Life magazine 2 months after my father either resigned or was fired. And I've now come to the belief that he was fired by LBJ in February of 1968. This is a Life magazine article, May 10th of 1968. Halfway through the very lengthy article, this is a quote from Robert S. McNamara. Around Washington, there is this concept of the higher loyalty. I think it's a heretical concept, this idea that there's a duty to serve the nation above the duty to serve the president, and that you're justified in doing so. It will destroy democracy if it's followed. You have to subordinate a part of yourself, a part of your views, end quote. And I want to remind myself and our listeners that just like men and women today taking their oath of office, my father took an oath of office that said, I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That was his oath, not to serve just in a loyal way to the presidents that he was serving for. So I take question with my father for not stepping out, and if he needed to resign while he was Secretary of Defense, to do so and join ranks with Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and others who were opposed to the war at that time. In so doing, he may have been able to end the war.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's interesting to me is I watched, I think I mentioned to you before we started that I watched The Fog of War last night, and the section in which they have the recording of him and LBJ talking, and in that recording, he tries to move the president to withdraw troops, to end the war. He talks about trying to get out of the war, and LBJ pushes him back into it. We can't really do that. I'd rather see us go and kill some folks, he actually says. So that's interesting. There was a part of your dad that knew, and it came out in the Pentagon Papers. He knew way back that it was unwinnable.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And throughout this process of writing my memoir, I've had an amazing opportunity to become very close to Daniel Ellsberg and his wife, Patricia, obviously one of the authors, Daniel, of the Pentagon Papers. And I've learned so much from Dan about my father, about the time. And one thing that I've learned is that the Joint Chiefs of Staff that served my father had probably wanted to ramp up the war in a much more significant way, certainly in bombing and the potential of this turning into a nuclear conflict, eventually with China. So one could look at my father's role as remaining in the Secretary of Defense position to ameliorate
the extremism. Yeah, good. That's interesting. So the thing that's clear is that you had stepped out of the milieu in which you were raised and you were in opposition. So that had to have been incredibly challenging for you and your relationship with your father. And you've talked about your attempts to bridge that gap, but it was unbridgeable from what you said. So you took off. You went to Latin America. Tell us about Latin America and tell us about how and why you got to agriculture. Is there something about agriculture that provided you what you needed to emerge from the shadow that your father cast? And you, in the book, you write these two sentences that I really hit me. A shield doesn't work. You used the term earlier when you described your father. He had a shield up. A shield doesn't work, you wrote. A shield casts the shadow. That was really interesting to me because that's what you had to deal with, his shadow.
Right. So the beginning of your question is the how and why of leaving Palo Alto on a February day or March day in 1971. You're absolutely right. Two of my very dear friends and I decided to take this journey. For me, it was, I think in our early 20s, I was 20 years old. It was facing the existential crisis that we all face at that time in our lives. Part of it was also the desire to get to Chile, a country that I'd studied in the sixth grade. And so with my dear friend Will and Rob, Will said, well, we must do this on motorcycles. And I said, come on, Will, let's maybe get a VW bus or we could hitchhike or go on public transportation. And Will is a very convincing friend. And he said, no, let's do it this way. So we started off Palo Alto. And remember, there was no Velcro. We didn't have Gore-Tex. We didn't have the types of wilderness or
protective
gear that we have today. The motorcycles had no fairings. They had no protection.
So mud.
Oh my goodness. So we started off, and the other thing we didn't have was Spanish. You would think that you'd start a trip to Latin America with a good understanding of Spanish. And I tell a funny story in the memoir about menudo, but I'll leave that to the readers to discover.
Yeah.
And I want to remind our listeners that Central America, particularly Guatemala, was in guerrilla warfare. And so the guerrilleros frequently rode motorcycles. So when we tried to enter Guatemala, and our trip through Guatemala was horrific. We were considered guerrillas, and we got through the country safely and finally. But when we got to Panama, another thing we hadn't counted on was the Darien Gap. There was no road connecting Panama to South America. There is no road to this day. Mm-hmm. So we found a fishing trawler and winched up our motorcycles onto the trawler, got to San Andreas Island in the Caribbean, which actually belongs to Colombia, and got marooned there for 3 weeks. Finally got a freighter to Cartagena. And once we got to Colombia, Will and Rob, when we got to Bogota, they said, basta, we've had enough of this trip. We're going to stay here. And I said, I need to keep going. My search has just begun. I too am done with the motorcycle, so I left it there. And
Did you know why you needed to go on?
I did, because I was searching. I remember this feeling of being an egg with a yolk, but I could not find my yolk. I could not discover my inner motion, my inner moral compass. And so it was a discovery to find that. And the beauty of your question and the beauty of my quest was I found it through subsistent farmers. So throughout Mexico, Central America, and particularly in South America, I lived on dirt floors. I helped farmers grow their squash, beans, and pumpkins and corn.
The Three Sisters, which you write about.
The Three Sisters. Eventually, I founded a small dairy cooperative on Easter Island. And Easter Island, off of Chile, off the Chilean coast, it belongs to Chile, speaks a Polynesian language called Rapa Nui. And in their native tongue, the name of their island is Tepitu Tehanua, which means the umbilical of the world. They are the most remote island of the world. So I spent a year and a half there.
That's amazing. Think about that. You went from the White House to the most remote island in the world. That's how big the shadow was that you had to get out of.
That was a huge
Jesus,
shadow.
That's an incredible thing, that journey.
You know, just like we didn't have Velcro and Gore-Tex, we didn't have cell phones. The only communication that I had with my family was through letters that my dear, dear mom would send me, and manila envelopes. She would send me Washington Post articles that she would tear from the paper. She would send me candy bars, because I loved candy bars. I mean, obviously, Latin America has delicious chocolate, but anyway, she would send, and because she would send me the candy bars, she would send me the stimulants, those little balls. But I want to just take a moment,
yeah, please,
when thinking about my mom, and read the dedication of my book, because it is to her.
Yeah.
And let me find it here. It says, "To Margaret McKinstry Craig, she gave me her maiden name, her Pacific blue eyes, and her love of nature. It is her love that has guided my life's journey." And that is truly the case. And while we're mentioning that, Michael, you and I shared before this conversation the gifts of love that my mother and father shared with me. And you also mentioned my memoir is a love story, very complicated, with a lot of complexity that we all have in our families, and things that I wished that we could have done differently, that I could have done differently. But the seeds of, well, it's interesting, I just used the word, the seeds of my farming today came from my parents.
Yeah, which is a beautiful thing and a remarkable thing. And one of the things that you and I talked about for this is the metaphors of circles and the metaphor of the tension, or the idea of the tension of the opposites. There's so much of that in the book.
Yeah.
And I mean, the idea of the heights that your father lived on, the fact that you went to ground, which is completely the opposite. Your father was kind of amazed that you have the quote about him saying to his friends, Craig, he's going to try and save the world through farming. I mean, to him, it was so foreign, probably.
It's interesting because my father had many careers, and the trajectory of his careers, the one that really stuck were those 8 years as Secretary of Defense. Prior to defense, he had an amazing career as a whiz kid at Ford Motor Company.
President of Ford Motor Company.
For 6 months.
Right.
The first non-Ford family member to become president. And then after his service as Secretary of Defense, to his retirement, president of the World Bank, he and my mother had the opportunity to travel to, I think, every country in the world and meet most of the prime ministers during that journey. Your question has to do with farming a little bit and agriculture. So here he is, president of the World Bank, which was lending significantly during the Green Revolution, creating dams across the world. And as we know today, dams have a significant downside. And
to the water cycle, the water systems.
To the water systems, to the villages and communities they serve, and to the siltation.
To the fish.
To all sorts of things. So here he is at the pinnacle of agriculture, But, as you said, not a real understanding of soil, certainly not an understanding of organic. I remember, Dad was a freeze-dried coffee sort of guy, and he loved tomatoes that he and my mother grew in our garden in Michigan. And he would go out, pick a fresh tomato, have a salt shaker, and it's kind of like Masimoto with his peach story,
right.
with the juice dribbling down his chin, the tomato dribbling down his chin. When I tried to tell him that, the organic walnut has a, terroir, has a flavor that comes from the soil chemistry, I don't think he didn't get that.
Yeah. I was struck by an attempt to heal it with him by making him a partner in the farm. Can you talk a little bit about that, your intention and where it ended up for you?
Well, yes. So let's jump from starting a dairy cooperative in Easter Island, spending another 9 months on an ejido in Michoacan, Mexico, a sugarcane growing area where I hoed sugarcane. And I remember a story. I was with my dear friend Manuel, who was the farmer growing the cane, and we were on a volcanic side, hilly, rocks, sugarcane growing up. And, after hours and days, I said, Manuel, I don't think I can do this any longer. We're just little by little inching away. And he said, Craig, just think about the plant that you're helping today, right now, that you're hoeing today. Just take it one plant at a time.
Wow.
So
wise.
A wise journey. But coming back then to the United States, going to UC Davis to study plant and soil science, knowing that I wanted to become a farmer. So
when did that happen? Was it on Easter Island or was it in Mexico? Was it before that?
It was the journey. It truly was a thread through Central America, through South America, on Easter Island, going back to Mexico for another 9 months. So I was on the road for 3 years out of the United States. It was that journey, and actually in Michoacan, working on a collective, an ejido, which came out of the Mexican Revolution. Mm-hmm. So that led me, knowing that I wanted to be a farmer, but I had no education as a farmer. So getting some of that from UC Davis, then I found an amazing mentor, Tan Lum, a Chinese farmer who had actually gone to UC Davis in the area of Yolo County. For 3 years, I worked with him and made so many mistakes and learned so much. 1980 came the time to start looking for land, found land. It was a seller's market. That meant it was very challenging to buy land. Mm-hmm. And luckily, my mother and father had put some savings aside for me. And I realized that's another gift, another white entitlement gift that I am the recipient of. I could not have done it without them. There's just no way. So my father and I became partners in Sierra Orchards in 1980. And eventually, I was able to buy him out. That became... just for any of you who are farmers listening to this story, you may experience the inequalities that happen sometimes between wives and husbands. So here, Julie and I are a couple. We're married, and my father and I are partners, and she is not a partner. And that was a completely imbalanced model, one that created a lot of strife in our family. So being able to buy my father out was a huge hurdle to get over.
We hope you are enjoying the conversation. If you are, please rate our podcast and offer a review. Your voice will help us grow our listener base, which helps us sustain the funding to share these conversations with the people and organizations shaping a more just and regenerative future. A future in which the food and farm businesses are helping to solve the largest challenges of our time.
A couple of things strike me here. There's the Tom Hanks movie, Forrest Gump. That story is so interesting, and it reminds me, it's a hero's journey, right? You had dyslexia as a kid. We didn't mention that, but it's in the book, and you talk a lot about it. Just like Gavin Newsom has dyslexia. It's very interesting how many people I know or have seen who have had very interesting lives who start out as dyslexic. I mean, it causes you to learn certain things and develop certain different ways. Yeah, very actually where you touch things and do things to learn. So anyway, in that movie, he is in all these incredible spots through history, through the 60s. And you did the same thing. Kennedy, you went to Chile. You were there during Allende. You were part of the Allende movement. You were La Lucha, I think it was called. You were part of that. He was assassinated. You came home. Then you got involved in organic agriculture, which was a cutting edge thing when you got involved. So you kind of had this you were part of the Vietnam protest movement. And so you had kind of a Forrest Gump type of story. And you ended up and you chose California. So all of this was about a healing, in my view, and you talk about it in the book. And towards the last, I guess the third of the book, you start talking about the relationship you had with Dean Rusk, his son, who was the Secretary of State, who was one of the three making all the decisions about the Vietnam War, and your decision to go to Vietnam finally. So why don't you just talk about that relationship to him, to Rusk's son, the decision to go, and then I want to get into the farm and what came off this land that really ended up being a healing experience.
Michael, thank you for bringing in the importance of healing, because it's something that's profound. It's something that I hope that we engage in every day. It's something that our communities and our world need more today than ever before. And let me share with you the story of my relationship with Rich Rusk, which began initially through email and then through phone calls. And believe it or not, I said to Rich on one phone call, Rich, we've never met each other. And he said, well, Craig, we probably did back in that January time when our fathers were sworn in. We were in the East Room of the White House. We were young boys. I would have been 10 and a half. He would have been maybe 14. And he's probably right. We may have met each other then, but as adults, we never did. Rich had a very interesting relationship with his father. They were so polarized from each other over the war, and because of Dean Rusk's hawkish opinions that never changed throughout his life to his dying day, that Rich had, I'll use the word, escaped to Alaska and became involved in both, I think, transportation and fishing. I think it was for 16 years. He returned to Athens, Georgia, later on in his father's life and in his life. Together, they did write a book about their experiences and their differences over Vietnam.
Wow, what a parallel.
Amazing. And Emily, my daughter, and I were preparing to make our first trip to Vietnam in November of 2017. When I returned, Rich and his son were preparing to make a journey early in 2018, and that was to a commemorative journey for the 50th anniversary of My Lai,
the massacre.
The massacre of My Lai. It was being organized by a mutual friend of ours, Chuck Searcy, who lives in Hanoi, originally from Georgia, and a very close friend of Rich Rusk. So Rich and his son were preparing for this trip. We exchanged several emails back and forth. Rich was concerned about how he would be perceived as the son of Dean Rusk. I said, Rich...
Because he was going with Vietnam vets, right?
Yes. And I said, the Vietnamese people are the most generous, embracing people and culture that I've ever witnessed. And the trip was planned. In mid-January, I discovered that Rich committed suicide.
Wow.
I don't know exactly why. I'm not sure anyone knows exactly why a person takes their life, but I can only guess that it was his relationship with Vietnam. And I think the importance of why I'm sharing this with you, Michael, is Vietnam lives. And there's a quote in my father's memoir, in retrospect, that I revisited the other day. Here he is writing in 1995, quoted from Robert S McNamara, "It is clear our nation has neither fully understood nor fully come to terms with Vietnam. The wounds remain unhealed and the lessons unlearned."
Wow.
That's 1995. And they are as unhealed and as unlearned today as they were then, and they were when he was leading the war. And it's a tragedy. In the movie The Fog of War, which you once again reviewed last night in preparation for our discussion, thank you, Michael, for taking this deep dive into our friendship and into this aspect of our lives together. My father came up with 11 lessons. Errol Morris,
right,
the documentary filmmaker, and he did that. The first one is empathize with your enemy. Had Robert S. McNamara embraced that during his service as Secretary of Defense, I don't think we would have been in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
He would have realized that this was intangible. The war had been fought for a long time, and our engagement started in the 50s or before that.
My dad had a roommate in college at USC in the 50s who was killed in Vietnam.
There you go.
In the 50s.
Yeah. So it just attests to that fact. Number 3 on the lesson list is there's something beyond oneself. Holy Toledo. Yes, that's true.
Right.
And then the final one, number 11, you can't change human nature. And the quote there is, in McNamara's mind, war is a natural facet of the human experience. And he says, quote, I'm not so naive or so simplistic to believe that we can end all war. Now that's a pretty heavy statement.
It's a very heavy statement. It actually takes me back to your attempt to heal, in a sense, what your father could not heal. So why don't you talk about your meeting with the artist Jan Vo, and your son Sean, because you have a very different relationship with Sean, your son, than your father had with you. And I think it's quite interesting, the bridge between you and your son, what happened here on the farm, and the cathedral block of walnut trees on this property and how they were used. But I also want you to talk about the Kennedy cabinet chairs that are all linked to the story that you had your eye on for much of your life, trying to get to.
Well, let me try to tell it to you in as succinct a way as I can. After President Kennedy's assassination, you can only imagine the trauma of Mrs. Kennedy returning to the White House with their 2 young children and the transition ahead of her, the actual physical move from the White House after your husband's been assassinated. She wanted to give Robert McNamara, my father, a memento for the time that he served the president and the friendship that he and JFK had. She decided to give my father his cabinet chair. It's a beautiful, beautiful chair. It was black leather, I believe, mahogany or walnut wood.
The pictures in the book are, you can see it.
And she gave him the president's chair. So those 2 beautiful cabinet chairs were forever in our living room at 2412 Tracy Place, Northwest Washington, D.C., as I grew up. And, we would sit in them, we would contemplate in them, and I figured that eventually upon my father's death, I have 2 wonderful older sisters, that we would share those 2 chairs amongst us. And they would sit in our living room. That did not come to pass. Upon my father's death, those chairs were eventually sold at a Sotheby's auction in New York City for hundreds of thousands of dollars. At that juncture, I was completely crestfallen. And I mentioned to a very dear friend of mine who happens to be a knowledgeable art patron in San Francisco, and she said, I know who bought those chairs. It turned out it was an amazing gallery owner, Miriam Goodman in New York City. She bought them on behalf of one of her cherished artists, as you mentioned, a Vietnamese man named Jan Vo. Jan was born in 1975. His family was part of the boat migration in very unsafe conditions, getting away from Vietnam. The family and others at that time happened to be picked up by a Danish freighter, and they became Danes. So Jan is now in his mid to late 40s, grew up in Denmark. He's a world-renowned sculptor and artist living in Germany. So upon that knowledge, Jan and I began exchanging emails. We eventually exchanged phone calls. And that spring, I invited Jan to the farm, and he spent 3 or 4 days with us, which was an absolutely remarkable part of my life journey. Because what came from that you're getting at is that our son Sean went to Germany to visit Jan on his farm, and together, Sean shared with Jan that part of our orchards are very old and need to be replenished, removed, and replanted. He and Jan came up with an idea for a part of our orchard that I call the cathedral block. It's cathedral-esque in the sense that there's 70-year-old trees that have these arching canopies and big limbs, creating this most natural religious base on our farm. And I never really wanted to take it out, but they were no longer productive. So they came up with this idea of harvesting the wood, leaving a few structural trees, and creating a legacy art project for the farm. We bought a sawmill. we cut down the trees. We created lumber from the black and English walnuts that Jan used in his art. And there was a show in London with his art, and prospective patrons could purchase pieces of art made from our orchard. So that is back to this healing and this circular motion of legacy, of recognizing, I would say, the generational trauma of the past, and trying to change that as we go forward, both
Transform it. Yeah, because there's a very interesting section in the book where you talk about where your dad went back to Vietnam for the first time and met with Giap, the general, who he was his nemesis. And you describe how difficult it was. Your father couldn't really connect with the people in Vietnam. He kind of had to march through crowds, and he didn't really engage the people where the wound was, because the relationship between the Vietnamese and the Americans was hate and war. You went back and you did just the opposite. You have these great stories about the people you met, how your guide took you to a place you didn't even understand why she took you, on a houseboat, and you just met the people, and you ate the food and you walked the markets. You did the opposite. What you did is you reknitted relationship. And it reminds me of Wendell Berry. Wendell Berry talks about relationship, the loss of relationship to the land, and the loss of relationship to community as part of the disease of our country and why we're so fucked up, pardon my French. But we are, and you have gone back to the land to create relationship. You went back to Vietnam to create relationship. You created relationship with a refugee from Vietnam who created art. That is a beautiful thing.
You've summarized it in its fullest context, Michael. Thank you. That's very powerful to me. And you're bringing in Michael Berry, and the loss of relationship to the land is exactly where we are today. And you mentioned Nam. Nam is the son of General Giap. Nam is just a few years younger than myself. And here we are, the sons, and my father was not a general, but the sons of...
Who ran wars.
Yes. And so General Giap was hand-selected by Ho Chi Minh to be Vietnam's military leader. When he died, I would say 10 years ago, millions of Vietnamese came to celebrate his life and journey and what he did on behalf of the Vietnamese people. That was not the case for Robert McNamara. And we met, Nam and I met, the name of Nam's wife is Rose. We met in General Giap's home in their backyard. And in their garden, there's a koi pond. There are roses, and the roses are growing up a trellis, and those trellises are made from the bomb casings of bombs that we dropped on Vietnam.
Wow.
And so it takes my breath away just to say that, and to think once again, so we've been talking about a circle and a cycle. Mm-hmm. We've been talking about healing, and we've been talking about loss of our relationship to the land. And you've drawn a parallel between my journey to do that and I think the fact that my father was not able to do that. And one of my great regrets in life is that he, Robert McNamara, and Craig McNamara were not able to do that together. And I just want to end that part on saying in 1995 when my father went to Hanoi to meet with General Giap, I said, "Dad, I'd love to go with you. I'm right here. I can take a week or two away from the farm and be there with you." And he said, "Oh, Craigie, I just don't think that's a good idea. It's not necessary." And you and I were talking before this conversation a little bit about why. Why would he say something like that? And Michael, share your theory.
I think my theory is that you brought feeling into his life, and to be the architect of a war, you can't have that much feeling, because war requires that you shut down pieces of your heart. Otherwise, you can't actually survive it.
Right.
And so for him to take you there would have been so painful, I think, because his emotion, you forced him to feel. You can see it in some of the dialogues you have. When Errol Morris asks him about your family, he can't go there.
He can't go there.
He can't go there because you were his feeling.
You know, I think we all, to one degree or another, use compartmentalization, and it has value, but you can't live a life compartmentalized. And I think for my father, Vietnam and the war and his decisions about the war fell into that, and it just bleeds out. And I think he was significantly wounded by the war.
Oh, he's depressed at the end of his life. He was on antidepressants.
Absolutely.
Tell the story of his conversation with you and you trying to assuage his fear about God.
Well, as his death was imminent, days before his death, I was coming back from the farm probably on a monthly basis and then a weekly basis, and then I just stayed with him. And at one point, I would say maybe 4 days or 2 days, I don't remember exactly, before he died, he said that he felt that God had abandoned him. And I said, no, Dad, I think God is holding you in the palm of his hands and letting you go. And I realized that maybe what I could have said is, tell me more, Dad. Why do you feel that God has abandoned you? I think my goal at that point was to let him pass peacefully and as naturally. And yet maybe I could have helped him do that more by understanding why he felt abandoned. And I'm only left with unknowns. I mean, what did he feel abandoned because of Vietnam? Did he feel abandoned by his family? So
perhaps it was relationship again, because relationship is what keeps us connected. The reason we have so many problems in the world, particularly climate, is we lost relationship with the natural systems. We lost relationship to the reality. And we're so alone and we suffer. We're suffering now. We're in the middle of heat waves, drought. I mean, we were talking, we took a tour of the farm earlier, and we were talking so much about water and drought. I mean, let's close this conversation and talking about the future, because this is the bridge I want to make. What you did to kind of learn from your father and to become a different kind of leader, because you have been the president of the State Board of Food and Agriculture. You were on my board. You were on the Route to Change board. You were a leader. You have been a leader in the organic community. You are a different kind of leader. Your dad used hard power. You have soft power. Your dad was isolated. You're related. This is a bridge you've made towards the future. It's what we need in the future. You and your son, Sean, have a very much different relationship. You are partners. Your dad would not really become a partner in the farm, but you and Sean are partners in the farm.
And Emily, don't forget.
And Emily, sorry, Emily, right?
Yeah.
So I just think it's fascinating about the future. So I'd like to hear from you about what you think we need to make it through going forward, because we are facing some stuff in the state around food and agriculture.
We are. And we are facing it in the fourth largest agricultural economy in the world, which is California. And we're facing it across the nation and across the world. This is a time unlike any that I've experienced in my entire life, certainly as a farmer. So you've mentioned soft power, and you've mentioned, you didn't say it, but emotional intelligence. Mm-hmm. You've mentioned touching the soil, touching and feeding communities. We are at a crossroads, the likes of which I said we've never seen before, and our family is at a crossroads. America, I believe that the United States needs farms like ours across America more than ever before, and yet we are on the cusp of losing exactly that. We are on the cusp of losing regenerative farms like ours. So what can we do about that? It's actually engaging in today's conversation, because today's conversation, those who will be listening will be asking questions of each other and asking questions of you and me. It's obviously building a market, it's building intelligence, it's building a vehicle for the types of farming that we're doing. You and I, as you said, took a fun trip around the orchards, and we could see and contrast
the differences.
And you know what?
Bare ground, herbicides on farms nearby.
Right. So I don't want to denigrate my neighbors. I want to embrace my neighbors, both here in this community as well as across the state. Let's change together. Let's recognize how we can feed the people. And there's something, we've used the term food deserts. I think you and I recognize food deserts are created by food apartheid. Mm-hmm. So they don't just naturally happen. Mm-hmm. It's
decisions.
It's decisions. It's almost by design. We have to change the design and make sure that everybody has access to fair, free, and nutritional food across the state. We can do this. The world produces enough food. Wars and lies and aggressive behaviors
Because our fathers lied.
Because our fathers. Now,
The title of your book.
I do want to share with you one last
Please.
thing.
Yeah, and is there a section you want to read to close?
Sure, there is. And I just want to say where my title comes from. It comes from a Rudyard Kipling poem that Kipling wrote. It's called Epitaphs of the War, 1914 to 1918. And as I did research into the poem, the actual line is, if any question why we died, tell them because our fathers lied. And the meaning is that Kipling's son wanted to enlist in World War I. However, just like you and me, he wore glasses and he was not able to enlist. His father lied on his behalf to get him enlisted. His son went to war. The story I've heard is that his glasses fell off. He was shot and killed.
Oh, wow.
And it's the sorrow of a father lying on behalf of his son and losing his son. So it's a moving, a very moving piece. And what I want to read, Michael, and no spoiler alert here.
Yeah, actually, just before you do that, let me just say this about the lies. The world we live in today, the challenges we have, is because we've been lying to ourselves. We've been lying to ourselves as society, as the globe. And I'm talking about really the developed nations of the world, the capitalist economies. We have been lying to ourselves.
We have been.
And that's why we're facing these things.
Yeah.
So
So this is a closing paragraph in the memoir, and I'm reading from it. Keeping an image nearby is painful. It's easier in many ways to throw that image away. Disowning my father, getting rid of his image, would enable the conviction that he is not part of me, that I am not like him, that his actions do not continue to weigh upon me, that they have faded from the lifeblood of the world and have run out the reel of history. None of that would be true. To say that I hate him, to call him evil, to deny the love that I have for him, these things would seem temporarily to relieve certain pressures, but they wouldn't be the truth. I don't want that because I want to be honest. It's impossible not to be my father's son. I can't be but what I am. This is not the end for me. And by that,
I love that, actually. I love that
I
ending.
mean that it's not,
Right.
that I'm still searching. And my memoir and the response to it, Michael, has introduced me to so many new people in my life, many Vietnam vets. Bobby Muller, an amazing man who led a platoon of Marines, took a bullet through his lungs and is paraplegic, has started the Vietnam Veterans of America, has been a leader, a vocal person, and many others. So this journey is just begun again.
Relationships.
Yeah.
New ones. Well, thank you, Craig. This has been really meaningful and heartwarming for me. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you for listening, and thank you to our sponsors, the Ladybug Foundation, Dan and Quincy Imhoff, Beth and Mark Wyatt, Cindy Daniel, and Doug Lipton. Roots of Change is a program of the Public Health Institute.